The night is absolute. No moon, no stars, just the black weight of a jungle pressing down on a line of Marines who can barely see the men beside them. October 24th, 1942, Guadalcanal, Henderson Field. A regiment of 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the elite Sendai Division is moving through the darkness. Their orders are simple. Destroy the airfield, destroy the Marines, and take back the island. They have numbers. They have momentum. They have the night. What stands in their way is a young sergeant from New Jersey, 2 sections of machine guns, and the engineering genius of a man who had been dead for 4 years. His name was John Basilone. The guns were Brownings, and what happened in the next 48 hours would prove something that no ordnance report, no field manual, and no army doctrine had fully anticipated. In the Pacific jungle, the weapon that kept firing was the weapon that kept men alive. If this is your first time on the channel, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we go deep into the real history behind the battles, the weapons, and the men who carried them. This story is one you will not want to miss. To understand what happened on Guadalcanal and what it revealed about American firepower in the Pacific, you have to go back to a workshop in Ogden, Utah, sometime around 1917. John Moses Browning was not a man who wasted time. Born in 1855, the son of a gunsmith, Browning had been redesigning weapons in his head since childhood. By the time the United States entered the First World War, he had already created some of the most important firearms in American history. The Winchester lever-action rifles, the Colt 1911 pistol, the M1919 machine gun. He was, without question, the most prolific and influential firearms designer who ever lived. In 1917, the U.S. Army had a problem. The Western Front was a meat grinder, and American infantrymen needed automatic firepower they could carry with them into the assault. The French had the Chauchat, a weapon so poorly made, so prone to jamming in mud and cold, that American troops called it the worst rifle in the world. Something better was desperately needed. Browning delivered 2 answers, 2 guns, 2 philosophies, and in the jungles of the Pacific 25 years later, those 2 philosophies would collide with the harshest testing environment in the history of modern warfare. The first gun was the bar. The Browning automatic rifle, officially designated the M1918. Browning conceived it as a walking fire weapon, a rifle that a soldier could carry at the hip and fire continuously as he advanced on enemy trenches, light enough to move, powerful enough to suppress. At 19 pounds with a loaded 20-round magazine, it fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the standard infantry rifle at a cyclic rate of between 300 and 550 rounds per minute depending on the model. It was gas-operated, air-cooled, and designed to be handled by a single man. The second gun was what would become the M1919, an air-cooled, belt-fed medium machine gun derived from Browning's earlier water-cooled M1917, where the bar was a rifle that could think like a machine gun. The M1919 was a machine gun that thought like a workhorse. Weighing 31 pounds without its tripod, it fed from a 250-round belt of ammunition and could sustain fire at a rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute. It required a crew. It demanded a position, but it did not stop. 2 Browning designs, 2 different answers to the question of what infantry firepower should be. In the forests of France, both seemed adequate. In the jungles of the Pacific, the differences between them would prove to be a matter of life and death. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War, they brought both guns with them. They also brought something no amount of testing back home could have fully simulated. The jungle. Guadalcanal sits in the Solomon Islands chain, roughly equidistant between Australia and Japan, a dense tangle of rainforest, kunai grass, swamp, and ridgeline so steep that men sometimes crawled on all fours to advance. Average daily temperatures hovered around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity was constant, oppressive, and total. The kind of wet air that makes metal sweat, makes wood swell, and makes the difference between a clean gas port and a fouled one, the difference between living and dying. The Japanese were not idle defenders. They knew the terrain. They moved through the jungle at night, in silence, in column formations that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Their tactics favored the ambush, the encirclement, the sudden close-range firefight in which every second of malfunction was fatal. In this environment, American infantrymen quickly discovered something the Army's ordnance experts had not fully appreciated in their testing back at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Heat and humidity do not behave the same way on a jungle trail as they do in a Maryland field, and the gap between the bar and the M1919 began to reveal itself. The bar's fundamental engineering limitation was its barrel. It was fixed. It could not be removed and replaced by the shooter in the field. On the Western Front in 1918, this had not been a catastrophic flaw. The bar was designed for short bursts of fire during the assault, not for sustained suppression. But in the Pacific, where a firefight could last for hours, where a bar gunner might be called on to fire hundreds of rounds in rapid succession to hold a defensive line or break contact on a jungle trail, that fixed barrel became the gun's greatest vulnerability. As the barrel heated, it heated everything around it. The gas cylinder, the gas port, the operating rod. The bar's gas system relied on hot propellant gases being bled from the barrel to cycle the action. Under normal conditions with proper cleaning intervals, it worked reliably. But in the jungle, two compounding problems emerged. First, the Army's standard M2 ball ammunition used corrosive primers, meaning that every round fired left a salt residue inside the gas system that, in the presence of tropical humidity, began to rust within hours of firing. The gas cylinder on the bar was never upgraded to stainless steel, unlike the M1 Garand's gas system, which received the upgrade before the war. In the field, this meant that a bar that was not stripped and cleaned with obsessive regularity, sometimes daily, could develop a gas cylinder rusted so badly it became inoperable. Second, the cleaning problem was compounded by the bar's own complexity. Its internal mechanism was elaborate by necessity. Gas-operated tilting bolt with a recoil buffer that soldiers routinely damaged by cleaning the gun vertically, allowing cleaning fluid and burned powder to pool in the mechanism. The gun rewarded meticulous maintenance and punished neglect. And in the jungle, with men exhausted from heat and disease and the constant psychological terror of unseen enemies, meticulous maintenance was not always possible. Army Lieutenant John B. George, who fought on Guadalcanal with the 182nd Infantry Regiment and later published one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of Pacific infantry weapons. His memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, first published in 1947, noted that the bar, while excellent for putting down a base of fire, was simply too heavy to carry effectively through the jungle terrain of Guadalcanal. The bipod and rate reducer added to the M1918A2 model, the version most widely used during the war, added weight without adding the one thing jungle fighters needed most: sustained reliable fire in the worst possible conditions. When troops stripped the bipod off the A2, which they frequently did, both to save weight and because jungle terrain rarely offered the kind of open fields of fire for which the bipod was designed, they were left with a weapon that was fundamentally a compromise. Too heavy to be a true assault rifle, too limited in magazine capacity to be a true light machine gun, and too maintenance sensitive for the environment in which it was being used. 20 rounds. That was the bar's magazine capacity. 20 rounds before the shooter had to reload, a process that took several seconds and exposed the gunner during a firefight. The British Bren gun, by comparison, carried 30 rounds and had a quick-change barrel. The Japanese Nambu Type 99 carried 30 rounds and also had a replaceable barrel. The bar had neither. This is not to say the bar was a bad weapon. It was not. Its 36 cartridge had tremendous penetrating power. It would pass through jungle vegetation, through logs, through light cover that would stop smaller caliber rounds or grenade fragments. Marines fighting in dense undergrowth on Peleliu, Iwo Jima and Okinawa valued the bar's ability to shoot through cover, not just at targets. The weapon was accurate, reliable when properly maintained, and capable of producing serious firepower at the squad level. By 1945, the Marine Corps had increased the number of bars per division from 513 to 867 and had reorganized the rifle squad around the bar as its primary automatic weapon, with riflemen supporting the bar gunner rather than the reverse. But the bar's limitations in sustained fire, barrel management and tropical maintenance demanded constant respect and constant attention from the men who carried it. The M1919 asked for something different. The M1919 Browning was, in many respects, the opposite of the bar. Where the bar was a weapon that tried to move, the M1919 was a weapon that tried to stay. Where the bar was designed for the individual, the M1919 was designed for the crew. The M1919 required at minimum a gunner and an assistant, a 5-man team in formal doctrine, and it weighed 48 pounds with its M2 tripod compared to the bar's 20-plus pounds in jungle configuration. What the M1919 offered in return was continuous fire. The belt-fed mechanism was its defining feature. A 250-round belt of 30-06 ammunition could be poured through the M1919 in roughly 30 seconds at sustained rates, and when the belt ran out, another could be fed without pausing the weapon. There was no magazine to change. There was no count to keep. As long as ammunition carriers kept bringing belts forward, the gun kept shooting. The M1919's mechanical design, short recoil operated with a tilting bolt locking system derived directly from the M1919, was among the most robust in the world. It fired from a closed bolt, which gave it excellent accuracy for a machine gun, and its operating principle was extraordinarily tolerant of the fouling, humidity, and abuse of sustained Pacific combat. In testing, the M1919 was documented to have fired over 21,000 rounds in rapid-fire conditions without significant mechanical failure. That kind of endurance was not a laboratory abstraction. It translated directly into combat performance. Lieutenant Colonel John George wrote of the M1919 in his Guadalcanal memoir, in language that has been echoed by veterans from Bougainville to Iwo Jima. He described the Light I-30, the informal designation for the M1919 in Marine Corps service, as having made an excellent trail block weapon and a reliable anchor point for defensive positions, being portable enough to keep up with rifle companies on the move through jungle terrain, yet heavy enough to establish a killing zone when emplaced. It occupied a tactical space that no other American weapon of the period could fully fill. He concluded flatly that the M1919 had a very good record in the Pacific, half of World War II. The Bougainville campaign report of the 3rd Marine Division said essentially the same thing. The Light 30 was preferred to the heavier water-cooled M1917 in the attack because of its mobility, its low silhouette, and the speed with which it could be repositioned. The same basic Browning recoil-operated action that had proven itself in the M1917 gave the M1919 dependability to go along with its sustained firepower. It got there on time. That phrase, "it got there on time," is the soldier's highest compliment for a weapon. Not beautiful, not elegant, not brilliant, just there firing when it was needed. American Rifleman editor Mark Keefe, speaking about the M1919's legacy decades later, reached for an analogy that captures the weapon perfectly. He compared the M1919 to an army mule, utterly reliable, capable of carrying any load, always working. John Browning, Keefe observed, got it right the first time. The M1919 also benefited from scale. Nearly 500,000 M1919 variants were produced during World War II, built by companies including General Motors' Saginaw Steering Gear Division, Buffalo Arms Corporation, and Rock Island Arsenal. The sheer volume of production ensured that replacement parts, replacement barrels, and trained armorer support were available across the Pacific in a way that more exotic or specialized weapons could never match. Logistics is doctrine made physical, and in the Pacific the M1919 was the most reliably supported automatic weapon in the American inventory. None of which means the M1919 was without its own flaws. Like the bar, it lacked a quick-change barrel system, a limitation that German engineers had solved brilliantly in the MG-34 and MG-42. In sustained firefights, crews had to manage barrel temperature carefully, firing in disciplined bursts rather than continuous streams. The M1919A6 variant, introduced in late 1943, added a bipod, a buttstock, and a lighter barrel specifically to address the infantry portability problem. But it weighed 32 pounds, actually heavier than the A4 without its tripod, and was 1 pound heavier than the A4 with its tripod. The Pacific had a way of making every engineering solution reveal a new problem, but these were manageable limitations. They were problems that trained crews, armed with doctrine and discipline, could work around. the fundamental mechanical architecture of the M1919, its recoil operation, its belt feed, its tolerance for hard use, was sound enough to absorb the worst the Pacific could offer and keep delivering fire.
Return now to Henderson Field.
October 24th, 1942. The guns that Sergeant John Basilone commanded that night were the M1919 Browning, the water-cooled heavy machine gun, predecessor to the M1919 assigned to heavy weapons platoons, while the lighter M1919 served rifle companies. The M1917 weighed 47 pounds and required a crew to move, but it could sustain fire almost indefinitely as long as the water in its jacket held out. In the fixed defensive position at the Lunga perimeter, this was exactly the right weapon, and it was the right weapon because it did not stop. 3,000 soldiers of the Sendai Division came screaming out of the darkness, throwing themselves at the Marine lines in wave after wave. They used grenades and mortar fire to silence gun positions. They formed human bridges over the barbed wire. They came in the rain, in the mud, across a front that Basilone's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, had described privately as indefensible. One of Basilone's gun sections was put out of action. He moved to the silenced position, carrying roughly 90 pounds of weaponry and ammunition across 200 yards of open ground under fire. He placed the extra gun into action. Then, under continuous fire, he repaired the disabled weapon and manned it. Personally, when his asbestos gloves were lost in the chaos, Basilone handled the searing barrels with his bare hands and kept firing. A survivor, Private First Class Nash Phillips, described seeing Basilone at dawn, barefoot, his eyes red from 3 days without sleep, his face blackened. With gunpowder, a .45 pistol tucked into his waistband, he had come to check on his wounded men. The line had held. The Sendai Division, one of Japan's most elite infantry formations, had been virtually annihilated opposite the Marine positions. At least 38 enemy dead were credited to Basilone himself. He received the Medal of Honor, the first awarded to an enlisted Marine in World War II. Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal. What the Henderson Field battle demonstrated, in the most unambiguous terms possible, was the decisive value of continuous automatic fire in the Pacific defensive battle. The Japanese infantry tactics of the period relied heavily on mass and momentum. What stopped mass and momentum was not individual marksmanship. It was sustained mechanical fire, the kind that a belt-fed Browning could deliver for hours, through darkness and rain and terror, as long as someone kept feeding it ammunition. The bar was part of that defensive architecture too. Marines with bars had fought that same night at Henderson Field, and across hundreds of other engagements on Guadalcanal, they had used the bar's penetrating power and automatic capability to deadly effect. But the bar's 20-round magazine, its fixed barrel, its sensitivity to fouling, these were constants that every bar gunner had to manage. Every hour of every firefight, in addition to everything else the jungle demanded of him. The M1919 asked less of its crew, not nothing. A well-run M1919 required trained gunners, disciplined fire control, and reliable ammunition resupply. But its mechanical architecture demanded less moment-to-moment intervention. It fired until it was told to stop, or until the belt ran out, or until an enemy round found the gunner. In the Pacific, that difference between a weapon that demanded constant attention and a weapon that rewarded steady feeding translated into the kind of sustained suppressive fire that won defensive actions. The story of the bar and the M1919 in the Pacific is not simply the story of one weapon failing and another succeeding. Both guns fought the length of the Pacific War. Both contributed to Allied victory. Both bore the name of the same designer, John Moses Browning, who died in 1926 without ever seeing the wars. His creations would define. What the Pacific revealed was something more subtle and more important, the way in which design decisions made for one set of tactical assumptions encounter reality on entirely different terms. The bar was designed for the walking assault on entrenched positions, a WWI concept built into the architecture of the weapon at the level of the magazine capacity, the fixed barrel, the rate of fire reducer. When the war the bar was built for turned into the war, the Pacific actually presented Close jungle ambush, sustained defensive fire, patrol contact at distances of 30 meters or less. Those original design decisions became constraints that no amount of field modification could fully overcome. The M1919 was designed for sustained suppressive fire from a crew-served position. In the Pacific, that proved to be exactly what was needed. Not just in defensive actions like Henderson Field, but in the infantry fire support role that accompanied every assault across every island from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The M1919's design assumptions aligned, almost accidentally, with the tactical requirements of the Pacific jungle fight in ways that the bars could not. This is not a lesson about good guns and bad guns. The bar was a good gun. The Marines who used it knew it was a good gun, and they kept using it and adapting it and building their tactics around it, because in the absence of anything better, a good gun with known limitations is better than nothing. The bar gunner who stripped his bipod to save weight, who cleaned his gas cylinder every day without fail, who counted his rounds and timed his reloads. That man was not working around a failure. He was doing what infantry soldiers have always done, making the tools. He had served the needs he faced. But the M1919 gunner, feeding another belt, adjusting his traversing handle, laying a beaten zone across a jungle trail at 2 in the morning. That man was working with design assumptions that happened to match his reality. And in war, when design assumptions match reality, men live. John Basilone did not survive the war. On February 19, 1945, he landed on the black sand beach of Iwo Jima as part of the first assault wave with the 5th Marine Division. He had turned down the opportunity to remain in the United States. After Guadalcanal, the bond tours, the parade crowds, the safety of the training command, he had asked to go back. In the first hours of the Iwo Jima landing, Basilone single-handedly destroyed a Japanese blockhouse and guided a trapped tank through a minefield while under fire. He received the Navy Cross for those actions, the only Marine in World War II to hold both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. He was killed by a mortar shell that same morning. He was 28 years old. The Browning M1919 remained in service long after Guadalcanal. Through the rest of the Pacific War, through Korea, through the early years of Vietnam, fielded by more than 70 nations across 4 decades of conflict. Converted to 7.62 NATO by the Israeli Defense Forces and the United States Navy's riverine forces, it was still delivering sustained fire in the 1990s from the same fundamental mechanical design that Browning had established in 1919. The bar was eventually replaced by the M60 machine gun in U.S. Army service and by the M249 squad automatic weapon in a later generation. But the quest it represented, a weapon light enough to move with the infantryman, automatic enough to suppress, has never stopped. Every light machine gun in every army in the world today is wrestling with the same design problem that John Browning confronted in his Ogden workshop in 1917. In the Pacific, the jungle made the argument that ordnance boards never could. It was not cruel. It was not unfair. It simply applied the same pressure to every weapon, every material, every assumption, and it accepted no excuses. Guns that demanded too much from their users in an environment that already demanded everything did not thrive. Guns that rewarded proper feeding and returned sustained fire. Those were the guns that held lines. The men who carried the bar in the Pacific were not failed by their weapon. They were asked to compensate for its limitations with their own discipline and skill, and in thousands of firefights across dozens of islands they did exactly that. That is not a condemnation of the bar. It is a testament to the men. But the M19, unglamorous, crew-dependent, heavy, demanding to carry, proved in the Pacific that John Browning's belt-fed architecture was something close to inevitable. In a war where the enemy came in the night, in the rain, through the jungle, the gun that kept feeding kept winning. The line held at Henderson Field. The line held at Bougainville, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. Every time at the anchor of the defensive line there was a belt-fed Browning, and a gunner, and an ammunition carrier, and the grinding, reliable sound of continuous fire in the dark. That sound was Guadalcanal. That sound was the Pacific War. And long after the jungle grew back over the battlefields, long after the last veteran closed his eyes, that sound remained. In the history books, in the medal citations, in the memory of Every Marine who ever heard it and knew that as long as it continued, the line still held.